So our topic is what I'll call the drive for power in the East. There is a tendency in the course to emphasize Western Europe as being synonymous with pretty much every development that we look at, whether that's the scientific revolution or the Enlightenment. So it's important to balance that out by looking at Eastern Europe, Central Europe. And it's a good way to test out whether concepts really apply, whether they're applicable, the extent and scope to which they apply. So there are some unique features of Central and Eastern Europe in terms of centralizing power. First and foremost, the nobility were larger and stronger in Central and Eastern Europe, so they tended to attempt checking the power of the centralized monarchy. Also, you had more multi-ethnic empires, which made it more difficult to communicate via language and also to get buy-in from different groups to support the central government. And you also often had larger geographic distances, which of course posed difficulties for transportation and communication. So we're going to look at three of the major powers with maybe some commentary about some of the other countries that existed in Central and Eastern Europe. And this also overlaps with a topic that we introduced a little bit in this unit, but we'll explore more in Unit 6, and that's enlightened absolutism. So it's a top-down government that policies made by the monarch and whoever works on behalf of the monarch. However, it's more based on principles of enlightenment to try to better the lives of citizens and to introduce more rational processes of government. So let's look first at Austria. So Austria, after 1648, was no longer really attempting to centralize Germany because of the division that was created due to the Peace of Westphalia settlement. So Austria is still a major power, and this includes the Holy Roman Empire, because Austria is the base of the Holy Roman Empire. So after 1648, they began to turn their attention to gaining territory on their eastern border at the expense of the Ottoman Empire. So one of the key dates here is 1683 is the last year that the Ottoman Empire threatened Central Europe, namely Vienna. And this attempt was defeated via a Holy League army of multinational forces, and this is pictured here. That's Jan Sobieski, the King of Poland, who helped lead this Holy League against, obviously this is partly a religious conflict between, at least perceived, between Christians and Muslims. So Austria won this war, and they gained significant territory at the Peace of Karlowitz in 1699, enhancing their eastern border. Also, Austria brought the Counter-Reformation to establish the uniformity of Catholicism. They subdued any local assemblies there, known as diets, and they established the hereditary rule of the monarch, of the Hapsburg monarchy in those places. And then they had to turn their attention to a bigger prize, which was the Spanish succession. So Spain's last Habsburg king, Charles II, died in 1700 without an heir. Both Louis XIV, the Bourbon monarchy, and the Habsburg monarchy of the Holy Roman Empire had married into the family. So there was a rival claims to the throne, and then this eventually engulfed the entire continent of Europe into the conflict, which ended with the Peace of Utrecht in 1714, which was really more of a compromise settlement where both sides gained something. So Charles VI, really there's only one issue that preoccupied his rule. He was the person who oversaw the end phase of this War of Spanish Succession, and that's what's called the Pragmatic Sanction. So he wanted to make sure his eldest daughter, Maria Teresa, who was his heir because he didn't have any other male heirs, would be accepted by all the other powers of Europe as the legitimate heir. So the Pragmatic Sanction was them agreeing to that. She couldn't be the Holy Roman Emperor because that has to be a male. All right, so Maria Teresa is arguably the greatest monarch in Habsburg history, depending on who you ask. I call her the matriarch of steel because while she was ruling from 1740 to 1780, she was able to have 16 children at the same time, okay? And one of her most famous children you've probably heard of, and that's Marie Antoinette, who later on married into the French monarchy. So the first thing she faced was a crisis. In 1740, despite having his father sign the Pragmatic Sanction, Frederick II, or Frederick the Great, attacked Austria in a very Machiavellian maneuver because he thought she was weak and he could gain the treasured province of Silesia, which at that time was part of the Austrian Empire. Silesia is one of the most important industrial and resource-laden provinces in Central Europe, and so Frederick wanted it. So the way she dealt with this is she was able to use her gender to her advantage. So she appeared before the Hungarian nobles. She was the king of Hungary, or the queen of Hungary too. They didn't necessarily have to support her, but she had just given birth to Joseph, the future Joseph II, who was about 3 or 4 months old. So in a dramatic gesture, while she was crying, of course for effect, she held her son aloft before the Hungarian nobles and said, "This is your future heir. He needs your assistance, your honor, your courage to hold on to what is rightfully his." And he held her aloft, and then, of course, the Hungarian nobles were overcome with emotion, and they agreed to support her. So this war engulfed all of Europe once again. So there's two wars between these two main rivalries. One rivalry is between Prussia and Austria, and the other rivalry is between France and Great Britain, which also includes conflict over colonies. So she ended up losing Silesia, although she was able to hold together the rest of her territory. So after the loss in 1748 by the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, she began a process of modernization. She broke local assemblies, she centralized the bureaucracy, she created more of a tariff union to allow for easier trade within the Austrian Empire, and she tried to reform some of the worst features of serfdom. She's generally not considered an enlightened absolutist because she didn't really patronize the Enlightenment, which was more secular and skeptical about religion. She considered herself a pious Catholic and supported Catholicism within her realm. She didn't really necessarily promote religious tolerance. So she also engineered one of the great diplomatic revolutions of this age. The country that was most consistently opposed to the Hapsburgs, you might remember, were the French because they were surrounded by it. So with her diplomats, she was able to convince the French to join an alliance against Prussia in 1756. Russia also joined this alliance. So that's a pretty huge array of powers against Prussia. Is you basically had Russia, Austria, and France, which outnumbered Prussia basically 20-1. So this initiated the so-called 7 Years' War, which, by the way, in the United States, or in the colonies, was known as the French and Indian War. And it was a war that almost defeated Frederick the Great. We'll talk about him in just a second. So she was unable to regain Silesia despite this alliance against Prussia. All right, so she ruled alongside her son Joseph for 10 years between 1780 and 1790. Joseph was the most committed of any monarch in trying to uphold the principles of the Enlightenment, maybe even to a degree that was unrealistic. In his lifetime, he issued upwards of 10,000 edicts trying to reform all features of Austrian politics, society, and religion. He attempted to abolish serfdom, for example, and attempted to use a new Enlightenment principle of economics called physiocracy, which basically freed the land from all these burdens to create more of a free market in agriculture, which he thought would improve the entire economy. He also eliminated and closed down any monasteries or other religious institutions that didn't do productive labor for society. He even extended toleration to Jews, he was one of the first monarchs to do that, allow Jews to worship freely, and extended toleration to other religious minorities within Austria. And he aimed to create a uniform legal code according to Enlightenment principles. However, his policies were so fast and so quick, and really didn't consult with a lot of groups, that he alienated a large group of people, especially the Austrian Netherlands, which is now Belgium, rebelled against him. The nobles, of course, didn't like his policies related to agriculture and serfdom, and of course the church didn't like his policies related to toleration of religious minorities and the edict on idle institutions. So, unfortunately for Joseph, he died young at the age of 49, and most of his reforms, almost all of them, were reversed upon his death. And actually, his gravestone even said, "Here lies Joseph, who attempted much, but failed in most." Okay, Prussia is an interesting country. It's actually called Brandenburg, Prussia. Brandenburg is a scattered dukedom, duchy within the Holy Roman Empire, and then there's one part of it called East Prussia, which is not part of the Holy Roman Empire, entirely enclosed by Poland. So, Brandenburg was one of the electors of the Holy Roman Emperor. So it was a very scattered state. It had small population, not a lot of natural resources, and it was, didn't even have contiguous or right next to each territory. So it experienced widespread destruction in the 30 Years' War. And so the person who basically lifted Prussia out of its backwardness was Frederick William, the Great Elector, not to be confused with the later Frederick William I. Okay, so he actually created a bureaucracy which was oriented just to supply and fund the army. So these two institutions evolved hand in hand, the bureaucracy and the army. So essentially the joke is that the Prussian state was created around the army. It was the army that came first, and the Prussian state was created around it. So he created Prussia's first standing army. It was mostly for defense, to make sure that other countries couldn't like run roughshod over Prussia, like, for example, Sweden and France and the Holy Roman Emperor. He was able to centralize authority by repressing local assemblies and also getting the Junkers or the Prussian nobility to support his policies by exempting them from the excise tax and also giving them pretty much absolute power over serfs. So the excise tax is a tax on goods that everybody purchases to fund the army and the functions of the state. He also welcomed those Huguenots that were persecuted and driven out of France by the Edict of Fontainebleau and welcomed them into Prussia, which of course advanced the economy. Okay, he was succeeded 2 generations later by Frederick William I, who I think is fair to describe was a martinet, somebody who was really focused on military virtues like stoicism, honor, courage, discipline, don't show your emotions, and that's pretty much how he ruled his family and also his kingdom. So pretty much a taskmaster, someone who just like stood over people and made sure they did their jobs. He also introduced a merit system, which allowed the middle class to rise up within society if they contributed to the state. And he created the most efficient civil service. These are just government officials who perform functions on behalf of the people of those areas. And he increased the army in size to 75,000 men, but he didn't really use it in warfare. And by the way, now the Prussian rulers are now allowed to call themselves the kings in Prussia because they assisted Austria during the War of Spanish Succession, and they gained that right. Instead of being the dukes of Brandenburg, they're now the kings in Prussia. Not of Prussia, but in Prussia. I won't go into the technical details why that's a significant difference. This is just a curiosity. He also created a regiment of all over 6-foot-tall soldiers called the Potsdam Regiment. I don't know if they were supposed to be intimidating on the battlefield or whatever. He also had a very troubled relationship with his son, Frederick II. Okay, so we'll move on to Frederick. So Frederick and his dad clashed significantly. Frederick was someone who really wanted to embrace the Enlightenment. He was more interested in reading works of philosophy, learning foreign languages. In fact, interestingly, of course, Prussia is a German power, but Frederick's main language was French, because French was the language of the Enlightenment, or the lingua franca of the Enlightenment. He also wanted to compose like sonnets. You can see him actually here at his palace, sans souci, which means without care, and he's actually composed a concerto for the flute, and he's performing it with an orchestra. So his dad basically thought that he was a sissy, in the terminology of the time, that he should become a man, and so Frederick, has difference of opinion about what his sexual orientation is, but he had a friend named Kate. They might have been lovers, they might not have been lovers, but of course his dad at the time thought this was terrible, and so Frederick, there's famous letters between the two of them, like, please Dad, I'm trying to do the best job I can to be your son and be a good heir to the throne. And his dad was like, I'm going to make a man out of you if I have to break you in two. So Frederick literally ran away. So think about this. This is not like just some average street kid. This is an heir to the throne, ran away from his kingdom, and he was eventually captured. And to teach him a lesson, his dad executed his friend Kate, who had run away with him, by beheading right before his eyes. Okay? Imagine your best friend being killed by your father by being beheaded right before your eyes. So a lot of people thought Frederick took over the kingdom of Prussia, he was going to drive it into the ground just to spite his dad, but in actual fact, he's probably the greatest ruler in German history. So he was, like I said, very interested in the Enlightenment. He invited Voltaire, who was the greatest philosopher of the time period, to his court. They clashed because they had giant egos. He also created an entire system of laws that had been codified into one uniform system based on Enlightenment principles. He wrote a couple of books. The Anti-Machiavel condemned Machiavelli's principles of politics, which is ironic because Frederick could be Machiavellian. And then also Forms of Government, which kind of portrayed society or the state as like a giant machine with the head of the state being the monarch. In fact, that was a term used. Think about Louis XIV. He said, I am the state. Frederick said, I am the first servant of the state, which is a very different concept or idea. This shows his enlightened absolutism. He reversed some of the policies of his predecessors, and so peasants didn't really gain a whole lot, and Junkers were returned to their privileged position within society. But he was the greatest military genius of the 18th century, and even though he was outnumbered in these two wars, the War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War, he was able to gain Silesia and then hold on to it. And this painting here was clearly taken at the end of his life, because you can see sort of like the agedness that comes from watching your capital city being burned to the ground and like basically running around on horseback trying to keep your army from, being destroyed by invaders. All right, moving on to Russia. So Russia, and this, these are perennial issues for Russia, which exist to this day. The joke is Russia's big and it's backward. It's just behind the other countries that didn't really experience the Reformation, the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and to some degree the Enlightenment. So just a little background. Ivan III is the one who helped create the new military class called the Streltsy, and along with his son or grandson, Ivan IV or Ivan the Terrible, they were able to establish control of Russia proper by driving out the Mongols, and also worked to suppress the noble class in Russia known as the boyars. Theoretically, the Russian czars, and by the way, the word czar is a derivation from the word Caesar, just like in German, when the German Empire is proclaimed later in 1871, the term is Kaiser. Those are both terms that mean emperor that are derived from the Latin word for emperor, which is Caesar. So theoretically, the Russian czar is an autocrat. In other words, he basically rules without any checks on his power and theoretically owns all the land in the country and then gives it to the boyars. Obviously, in reality, he doesn't have that extent of power, mostly because of how vast it is to rule Russia. So these two rulers established a greater control of the Orthodox Church, which is the main religion in Russia. Russia, as I said before, was just way behind. So if you were a Westerner who visited Russia, you would have felt like you had walked behind a veil into an entirely different culture and society. It was way different in terms of like how people dressed, how they acted. It just didn't seem very modern. Ivan the Terrible killed his son in a fit of rage, plunging Russia into the time of troubles, which lasted until the Romanov dynasty was established in 1613 with Michael Romanov. Okay, so you had several rulers of Russia until we get to Peter the Great. So Peter was the one who really dragged Russia kicking and screaming into the modern age. By the way, Peter literally and figuratively towered over his people because he was 6'9". Okay, so here's an image I like. I showed you the picture of Louis XIV. So picture Louis XIV with his tights on and his high heels. He's probably about 5'4", and they're playing a one-on-one basketball game. And Louis XIV like scraping along the wooden floor with his high heels on, trying to like guard Peter the Great, who's just like doing 360 jams right over the top of him. I just kind of like that image. I'd like to just I'd pay $50 to watch Peter the Great and Louis XIV just have like a one-on-one basketball tournament. So Peter grew up in a part of Moscow called the German suburb, which is basically where a lot of foreigners live. And Peter really liked foreigners because they were just different from most of the people that he encountered, they were just more, the people he encountered in Russia were like he viewed as mystical and supernatural and just like devoid of practical knowledge. So these were Dutch people, Germans, French people, Swedes, and so he like picked their brains and like how does your technology, how does your science work? And even throughout his entire reign, he used foreigners as advisors. So he recognized that Russia was backward and he was going to do something about that. And by the way, he didn't necessarily do it in a nice way. One thing he did is he forced the Russian Orthodox Church to modernize, and this created opposition among what are called the Old Believers. He also went on what's called the Great Embassy between 1697 and 98, where he dressed incognito and like literally learned how to build a navy and how to do manufacturing and to like patronize technology and science. He had to come back because the Streltsy were revolting. This was the like military class that Ivan III had created, and they were opposed to his policy. So he brutally crushed them, tortured them personally, and hung their bodies outside the city as a warning to anyone else. Okay. He also liberated women from the household. They didn't have to wear veils anymore, and he really wanted to import manners of the West. So he didn't want these like Methuselah beards that his nobles wore and these really long coats and these like what he considered to be Asian sort of like dress patterns. So he shaved off their beards or taxed their beards, and he forced them to adopt Western customs and dress. He also introduced a merit system called the Table of Ranks, where you could move up into society based on your contributions. And the Senate here is not like our Senate. It's not like a legislative body. It's really just a council of advisors that he used to implement his policies, such as mercantilism. He wanted Russia to have like trade and commerce, and he wanted it to expand geographically, not through overseas colonies, but by contesting with Sweden, which was the largest power in the north. Sweden had gained its privileged position by basically winning the 30 Years' War. So he contested with them through a very long war known as the Great Northern War, which started in 1700. He lost a lot of the early battles. He adapted his tactics. He learned from his mistakes. And by 1721, he had emerged victorious with the Treaty of Nystad, which allowed him to establish a new capital city called St. Petersburg, named after himself, which became the Venice of the North. By the way, a lot of people were forced to build this city. Serfs were, and a lot of them died under pretty bad conditions. So Peter's reforms didn't necessarily seep down to the core of Russian society, certainly not to the serfs, who were 85% of the population, but he did help make Russia a feared power that was part of the European state system. And then that was taken up by Catherine the Great. So after 5 not-so-great rulers, Catherine, who was actually German, who had married into the Russian monarchy, took over. And she was very strong-willed. Anybody who met Catherine, and she did have a lot of, philosophes at her court, Voltaire and Diderot, were just smitten with her charm and her facility with language and her knowledge of Enlightenment principles. But she could also be very Machiavellian in her policies. So she even got involved in a palace coup against her husband, Peter III, and she was involved in plotting his assassination because he was considered to be a really bad ruler, because he was giving back all the gains that Russia had made during the 7 Years' War. So she patronized the arts, she patronized education, she created schools for girls, she believed strongly in the principles of the Enlightenment, as she stated in her legislative commission, where she wanted to implement an entire system of law based on Enlightenment principles. But here's the problem with Catherine. Most of her projects she started were never finished. And that's because she faced a lot of opposition by being a woman, because the nobility had strengthened in power between her reign and Peter the Great's. And so a lot of the stuff that she started out never really reached fruition. She did have some degree of religious tolerance, and she, like I said, promoted education. She also wanted to free the nobles from enforced state service, so she created a charter that outlined their rights and responsibilities. This was supposed to be the beginning of an entire constitution for Russia, but that project, like many others, was never completed. All right, so she did make serfdom worse because she sold off a lot of crown lands to nobles, and they had less protection under nobles than they did under the direct control of the state. So there's a gigantic peasant revolt in the 1770s called the Pugachev Revolt. Even though she had abolished capital punishment, she made an exception for Pugachev and the leaders of the revolt and crushed it. It's the biggest peasant revolt in European history. So her most important accomplishment has nothing to do with enlightenment, it has to do with warfare and territory. So she constantly was at war with the Ottoman Empire on her southern border. I mentioned, the conflicts with Sweden, which kind of left over from Peter the Great. And she also was involved in all 3 Polish partitions. So Poland didn't have a strong central government. And so in 3 different partitions culminating in 1795, the country of Poland, which at one point was the largest country in Europe, was completely wiped off the map of Europe, not to be recreated until 1918 at the end of World War I. Okay? So despite all this glimmering facade of power and wealth, there is this reality check, which is the so-called Potemkin villages. One of her advisors, some of her advisors were also her lovers, which she used to manipulate them, including the King of Poland, had built these villages for foreigners visiting, foreign dignitaries. And they were basically just a facade. It wasn't an entire actual building. It was just the facade that made everything look really nice to the outside. And the grubby serfs were told to hide behind the facade. And then they hired actors to portray well-developed, educated serfs. And that's sort of the image of Russia, this facade of power and wealth to the outside world, but then it hides a lot of the deeper problems within Russia.